All right, in our last discussion on social movements, we want to think about some basic questions about why do social movements happen? Why do these mass organizations of people for a given collective end happen? And why do they succeed or not succeed? There's a couple theories we want to look at here. Uh, One of the main theories that most people have in the back of their heads, even if they don't articulate it, is what we call relative deprivation. We've seen this word relative before in things like poverty. We talk about relative poverty is you're in poverty compared to the relative standard of living in your society, relative to what other people around you have. With relative deprivation theory, the idea is that people will join a movement, will sacrifice things to fight for a new way if they feel they are relatively deprived compared to those around them. Now, even the poorest in our society are much richer than some of the worst off in Kenya, but that doesn't mean that they're always going to be comparing themselves to some of the worst off people in Kenya. They're going to be comparing themselves to others in their own society. And the idea here is that if people feel that they've been systematically deprived of something, of school, of economic access, of jobs, of life, then they will mobilize together to fight a particular cause. This is an interesting theory, but it begs a lot of questions for us about. There's lots of instances of relative deprivation, and it doesn't really tell us why there's so many instances in which people don't mobilize. We saw in earlier videos that we have extraordinary inequality in this country and extraordinary deprivation, and yet we haven't really seen a whole lot of movements around it, except briefly after the 2008 financial crisis. Another set of theories is a bit more complex. It talks about resource mobilization. That means, does a movement have the resources it needs to mobilize and be successful in achieving its goals? So there's different kind of resources we can think of, among them money and organization. Do they have funding? Do they have a network? Can they communicate with us? So if we look at um, very dynamic movements like those in Hong Kong, um, we see that organization is provided through various apps and media communication channels. Like communication and organization are central. Um, and unlike earlier movements, such as the civil rights movement or even the LGBT movement, um, we see today that movements are much more fluid and dynamic. There is organizational structures to liberate students who are held up in a campus by the police, and people organized to get them resources. But that organization had to be dynamic because the authoritarian state in Hong Kong, or increasingly authoritarian state, uh, repeatedly would adapt to them, and they would have to adapt to the state. So they would find the channels they were using for communication and try to use them. And so the people who were mobilizing and resisting the state would have to find different channels and different avenues to communicate where the police were. So the Hong Kong example is a very interesting one, and it also points out one key thing that we don't see on the screen here, which is that of a triggering event. Often for major social change, some massive or large triggering event is the key to gather the anger, the deprivation, and the sentiment. We might note that deprivation and mobilization can go hand in hand. So if we think about Black Lives Matter, it was the death of Mike Brown, even though, and Trayvon Martin before him, um, that really started to build up the tension and the movement. But the triggering event was really the death of Mike Brown in Baltimore, which had been a society that had felt a lot of relative deprivation. And this gave the spark to the gathering fumes of discontent. In Hong Kong, there was a law passed to extradite political dissidents. All that means is that the Chinese government that's slowly been dominating more and more of Hong Kong, who used to be independent of China, um, said they could just move people arrested for political distance from Hong Kong to China, where they don't have as much freedoms. And people didn't want to do that because once you go to China, you disappear because they have a police state. So there's another example of a triggering event. But they can also be exogenous events like a coronavirus. Um, Many of us have been experiencing greater and greater uncertainty, inequality in our society, and the coronavirus pandemic has really um, brought this inequality and the fragility of all our lives into stark relief. And the question is, will it be enough to mobilize people to change our society, to make it less austere and more equitable? So there have been a number of major social changes we've seen here. And we can think about why are some of these contemporary movements successful, why are some not? Why has LGBT equality been so successful, but not environmentalism? How does our perception of it being related to us really matter? We've seen the world become much more globalized. We've seen human rights become central. What makes movements successful or not? So basically, if we wanted to have a fundamental model of how change happens, this seems a little abstract, but fundamentally we have groups in society. We have maybe business owners and workers, men and women, who come into conflict and through social movements, through mobilization and deprivation, come to advocate for social change. And depending on the outcome of that action and conflict, social structures may change or may remain the same. So workers mobilized for minimum wage rights, for um, health insurance benefits, these sorts of things. And that changed the structure of institutions, but it also changed the dynamic between groups. Now workers had a bit more power over the process of production. So this is a continual kind of processual thing. Social change changes the dynamic between groups and changes the power relations. How are we going to see the outcome of this in our society today? How can we use these models to understand how to advocate for our own needs and to change issues that we feel strongly about?